Logan Paul's code hostage nightmare and how it could have been prevented. What went so wrong that one of YouTube's biggest stars found himself in the middle of a tech disaster that could end up costing millions, not to mention the damage to reputation? How did a venture with so much potential end up in a catastrophic code standoff? How did this happen despite the fact that Logan Paul is a famous public figure and despite the fact that the programmers he hired came highly recommended through his trusted personal connections? And what can an ordinary startup founder do to avoid becoming a victim of a silent code hostage trap? In today's episode of the Startup Captain podcast, we'll dive deep into the lessons from Logan Paul's ordeal and arm you with strategies and tools to ensure you never face a similar fate. And even if you have become a victim of a code hostage situation, you'll be relieved to learn that there is a way to get out of this disaster. My guest today is back on the show by popular demand. He is a Startup Life hardened CTO, founder, angel investor, and startup advisor. In our previous episode, he shared his personal experience on dealing with code hostage situations for his clients. And today he agreed to talk about Logan Paul's ordeal and how any startup founder can avoid becoming a victim of a code hostage situation. The name of my podcast guest today is Shoukri Kattan. Welcome to the show, Shoukri.
Thank you, Alex. Great to be here.
Shoukri, to those unfamiliar with the specifics, can you briefly explain what happened with Logan Paul and the code hostage situation he found himself in?
So here's what we know about the Logan Paul situation. Logan Paul found a trusted developer through his network who started working on his crypto game. And halfway through, we heard that developer essentially walked away due to non-payment, taking with him the entire code base. That's what we know so far. We also know that Logan Paul now is subject to a class action lawsuit because of that. And it's truly an unfortunate situation. But this is not a new situation, and many founders face this challenge on a daily basis.
Logan Paul is a famous YouTuber with over 20 million subscribers, and yet, despite his vast resources and connections, he still fell into this trap, the code hostage trap. What were the key missteps or oversights that led to this disaster? And how did the programmers he trusted, especially those recommended through personal connections, end up turning against him?
So from my understanding of the situation, I believe there's a couple of big mistakes. The first one is legal and contracts. And from the way I'm following the matter, it sounded like there is no contracts and there's no paperwork in place. And that's generally where the problems start. Ideally, if that developer was in North America, Logan Paul, in theory, can be covered. And so if he is subject to a lawsuit, he can always kind of turn back and sue those developers because he has a legal agreement in place. And so the first thing that founders should do is have a legal agreement in place. And the second is the alignment of incentives. So it sounds like the incentives between Logan Paul and the developers were not necessarily aligned, which resulted in that fortunate situation. The third thing that Logan Paul could have done is made sure he has access to that source code from day one. Ideally, he would have worked with a fractional CTO or brought someone who is technical and maybe not as involved in that day-to-day delivery and have him oversee that process. And this challenge is not new. We see that with founders day in and day out, where they start working with an independent developer. And this is actually especially important if you're not dealing with a development agency or a company, because you have other means to deal with a legal entity.
So you mentioned fractional CTO. What is a fractional CTO?
Let's start with what's a CTO. And a CTO is a Chief Technology Officer. It's someone who is a technology executive who has a lot of experience. A good CTO is someone who has been a software developer, has that technology background, but at the same time, He's focused on the legal, intellectual property, structure and architecture of an application being built, such as Logan Paul's game. So ideally, Logan Paul should have hired someone who's technical to oversee the process and not work directly with one or more developers without having a legal structure in place, and that's important.
And the fractional CTO then?
To hire an experienced CTO, you're probably going to be paying 200K plus for a full-time CTO in terms of salary. And a fractional CTO is someone who's doing this as a consulting, as a partial role. So this could be someone who allocates something between 2 to 4 hours a day, where he's involved in the project, yet he's not there in the day-to-day business. This is a great setup for early stage startups or for early stage projects where a full-time CTO is not required, yet you need that oversight.
So a fractional CTO could be thought of as a neutral third-party expert that helps with setting things up, right?
And it's a person who is able to speak both the business and the product language, as well as the technology language. So he's comfortable dealing with the C-suite, comfortable dealing with customers, comfortable dealing with marketing teams, sales, biz dev executives, and at the same time is able to speak to the tech team and spell out what needs to be built and how.
Oh, and just a reminder to our viewers, we're talking about the CryptoZoo game that Logan Paul tried to develop as a business, as a side business. So, drawing from Logan Paul's experience, what are the red flags startup founders should be aware of when working with developers or agencies? Logan Paul is a public figure with a massive following. Do you think his fame played a role in how this situation unfolded? And how can other public figures or influencers safeguard themselves when starting a business that requires programmers?
So there's 3 things that founders, celebrities, influencers, and Logan Paul should have done. The first is have a legal entity and proper paperwork. And I've seen this over and over again, whether you're working with an independent developer, a software development agency, or even your buddy from college. The thing that happens over and over is that, it's human relationships. These relationships can go sour, can go bad. And the only thing that can save you at the end of the day when those relationships have gone bad is the legal system. So make sure you have paperwork in place. The second item is access to the code base. If you don't have access to it, if you're not the owner to that code base, it's not yours. It can be gone. A developer can hold it hostage, such as what happened with the Logan Paul situation. And thirdly, make sure your incentives are aligned. So agree with the developer or an agency beforehand what is being developed, how long it's going to take, and how much that's going to cost. And make sure you spell that out in detail. And this is where things go wrong, is that what you expect them to develop versus what they develop is something completely different. And this is where a lot of conflicts arise. And the easiest thing to do in such conflict situation is you withhold payment. So maybe Logan Paul withheld payment, and in retaliation, the developer or the agency will hold the code hostage, and now we have a hostage situation on our hands. So avoid these hostage situations, and the way you do that is align the incentives, have the paperwork, and finally, if you've paid for that code, it is your right. Make sure you have access to it, make sure you get a fresh copy of it every single time there's new code base that exists, or every time a new line of code is added.
Considering Logan Paul's situation, how can ordinary founders ensure they're not over-reliant on a single tech team or individual, even if they come highly recommended?
For startups in the early days, and this is especially important if you're working with a single developer, is that you have a single point of failure. All it takes is for that developer, for something to happen to him, he's hit by a bus, and now code base gone, project gone, there is no way to resume. And so what you want to do from day one is what enterprises knew from the beginning, is you do what's called BCP, or business continuity planning. So as part of your continuity planning, you ensure that whoever the developer or the agency you're working with have proper documentation in place that walks someone through what is the process. Let's say that developer is hit by a bus and now you need to swap him out with another developer or with another agency. You need to make sure you have a transition plan. You need to make sure that the new developer or a new agency who's coming in is able to come up, understand the work that was previously done, and then able to continue on that work. And to do so, you need to have the code base in the first place, and then documentation that states, how do I run the system? How does it function? What are all the functionalities encapsulated in it? And that's how you protect the downside. And we know that startups are inherently fragile, especially in the early days. So the sooner you do this, the better. And of course, as you kind of transition from a startup to scale up, this becomes extremely, extremely important. Even your full-time CTO, even your team can become a single point of failure. In fact, here's a funny story. In the early days of Reddit, Alexis Ohanian was working with one of their senior developer, Chris Slow, and Chris took a day off and he was in a cottage and they couldn't reach him by cell phone, and Reddit was having an outage. And word has it, they couldn't get a hold of the guy. And so in a moment of genius, Alexis decides to call a local pizza delivery guy and get him to deliver a pizza and deliver a message to the developer. And luckily, that plan worked. Otherwise, Reddit in the days would have had a massive outage. And so this is the life of early stage startups. It's dangerous, it's not resilient, and your goal is to build resilience as soon as you can.
In the aftermath of such a public debacle, what tools or platforms could Logan Paul or any other founder use to regain control and ensure their code is secure?
So the easy answer is make sure you have access to that source code wherever it is, on whichever tool, whichever software your developers use to manage the source code. You want to make sure you have access to that and make sure you are the owner. If you don't know how to approach it, your best bet is to go find someone technical. It could be a fractional CTO, it could be another senior developer, and work with them as an independent party to come in, audit the work, and make sure you have access. And finally, we've tackled this in another episode, so make sure you go back to that episode and refer to the tools we were mentioning there.
If a high-profile individual or any founder finds themselves in a code hostage situation, what immediate steps could they take to mitigate the damage and to regain control?
There are a few approaches and there are a few tools we can use to recover. The most important step is, if you are in conflict with whoever is holding that source code hostage, you need to de-escalate the situation ASAP and seek immediate professional help. It could boil down to good old hostage negotiation, where you involve another party who's able to talk some sense into both parties and reach a settlement to be able to hand over the code in a peaceful way. That's one way to do it. If you're not in a code hostage situation, but you suspect you're approaching one, seek immediate help and do not make your intents clear to the agency or to the developer that you don't trust them. Keep things status quo until you seek help. This is how you avoid getting into that situation. The second is avoid escalating that situation. So if it happened and it's bad, you don't want to lose contact completely. You want to kind of get things calmed down. And so this might be dropping a note to that developer or to that agency that, hey, things got out of hand. Let's take a moment and take a breather. That's the second best thing. Now, third, and we have at our disposal specific techniques that we could resort to depending on the situation. So this could be, if we have access to the actual app, we could use reverse engineering techniques to reconstruct the code. It's tricky, it doesn't always work, but this could be a salvageable situation. And again, there's other tricks of the trade that I don't think we'll be able to cover or will be appropriate to cover on this podcast.
Trust seems to have played a significant role in Logan Paul's situation. How can founders strike a balance between trust and vigilance when working with tech teams? I
like to always say trust, but verify. And so the right way to approach it is that One, trust is built over time, it's earned, and it starts with aligned incentives. If the incentives are not aligned from day one, if there's conflicts that are happening from day one, most probably these things will escalate over time. And so one, make sure your incentives are aligned between you and the developer or the agency. And second, verify frequently. So if that developer or that agency promised you to do certain things by a certain time, by a certain date, if these things are met, great. This kind of gives you a signal that things are looking good. If you see a situation, and software projects, a lot of times things go off the rails, and what is important is how you handle these situations, both you as the CEO, founder, influencer, and how the agency handles that situation. So what we're looking for is for both parties to take ownership in what went wrong and work to fix it from there. And finally, always work with trusted people, even if it means you're maybe paying a premium to do that. It's worth it, because at the end of the day, this is your code, this is your intellectual property, this is your effort, this is your idea. And the last thing you want is, hundreds of thousands of dollars later, you have nothing to show for it. This is a horrible situation to be in. So ideally, proper due diligence before you're starting with that agency or developer, check references, have legal paperwork in place, and trust, but verify.
Given the publicity of Logan Paul's situation, do you see the tech landscape changing in terms of how founders approach their tech partnerships?
Overall, I think we have smarter founders today, and thanks to your content, thanks to all the content that's out there, founders are becoming more tech savvy, awake, and alert. And I believe in the future, there's going to be better technology tools to prevent these things from happening.
So for founders and influencers who might be venturing into tech projects, what's your single most important piece of advice to ensure they don't end up in a Logan Paul-like situation?
It's simple, really. Own the source code. Make sure you have access to it at all time.
Excellent. Shoukri, thank you so much for shedding light on such a crucial topic. To our listeners and viewers, if you'd like more in-depth information on this topic, there's going to be a link to the previous podcast episode in the description. Keep boosting your business and join us for the next episode of the Startup Captain podcast.